Hi, welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining tonight's event. My name is Francis Shen. I'm a law professor and faculty member in the graduate program in neuroscience at the University of Minnesota, as well as co-director of the Neurotech Justice Accelerator at Mass General Brigham, and have the great honor of moderating our panel tonight. A few housekeeping notes at the beginning. We are recording this event so that others can watch later. And our plan for tonight is straightforward. I'll provide a brief introduction and then introduce each of our esteemed panelists. And then for about the first half of the first 30 minutes, our panelists will discuss the National Academies report, and that will leave us about 25 to 30 minutes for your discussion and engagement at the end of the evening. You have a couple ways to get involved in that second half. One is you can use the Q&A function to type in your question, and I'll read out as many of those as I can. Or by design, this is an interactive meeting format, not a webinar. So in that second half, you'll be able, if you want to enter the discussion queue and unmute and ask your question live. Do note that the chat is disabled. Okay, so let me introduce the grant that is supporting this work. Along with two co-PIs, Dr. Jonathan Jackson of Crescent Advising and Dr. Susie Huang of the MGH Martino Center, we co-lead an NIH Brain Initiative neuroethics grant called Improving Recruitment, Engagement, and Access for Community Health Equity in Human Neuroimaging Research. That's a mouthful, so they've got a good acronym, Reach for Brain. And tonight's event is supported by Reach for Brain. I just want to give you a word about the work that we're pursuing and how this event fits in. So part of the work led by Dr. Jackson and our co-I Helen Hemley is utilizing community engagement with Black and Latinx stakeholder networks to co-create new evidence-based solutions, on-the-ground solutions to expand the inclusiveness of participation in neuroscience research. So that's really on-the-ground research, and stay tuned because a little later this spring, we're going to have another event like this where we'll deep dive into that work. But in addition, and our topic for tonight, Reach for Brain has a national working group of experts, and thanks to some for being here tonight, to develop consensus guidance and applied tools for neuroscience researchers on how to measure, use an analysis, and report on participants' sociodemographic identifiers such as age, gender, and especially race and ethnicity. This is a really important challenge as neuroscience research participation becomes more inclusive. Questions like, should race and ethnicity descriptors always be collected and reported? Why or why not? What definitions should be used for these categories? How could this data and categorization be misused? And to kick this off, we're really excited that tonight we're going to get to learn from two members of a really important National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine committee that released in 2024 a highly informative report, Rethinking Race and Ethnicity in Biomedical Research. So without further ado, let me introduce both of our guest speakers. Ruqaiijah Yearby is the inaugural Kara J. Trott Professor in Health Law at the Moores College of Law, professor in the Department of Health Services Management and Policy at the College of Public Health, and a faculty affiliate of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University. An expert in health policy and civil rights, Professor Yearby has received millions of dollars from the NIH to study structural racism and discrimination in vaccine allocation, and also been supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to study equitable enforcement of housing laws and structural racism in healthcare. Dr. Margaret Moss is an enrolled member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation in North Dakota, and is a professor and associate dean for nursing and health policy at the University of Minnesota School of Nursing. She holds many degrees, PhD, RN nursing doctorate, and Juris Doctorate degrees, has been both a nurse for 34 years and an academic for 20 plus years across multiple universities. She has extensive experience in both applied work and leadership, including just a little bit of the CV, sat on the American Academy of Nursing Board of Directors as a member of the National Academy of Medicine, as well as the National Academies Board on Population and Public Health, has participated in many important committees, including the Federal Policy to Advance Racial, Ethnic, and Tribal Health Equity, and is author of many texts, including American Indian Health and Nursing and Health Equity and Nursing. I could go on and on about both of our guests, but if I read you all of their amazing CVs, we'd never get to the program tonight. So let's do that. Let me spotlight both of you. And then, okay, there we go. Okay, we'll spotlight both of our panelists and kick this off with the following question. Professor Yearby and Dr. Moss, you were each members of this really important National Academies Committee. Could you please share with us, and I think most of us probably haven't seen the report, on what the committee did, what the report kind of says, and what you view as some of the committee's most important recommendations for those of us involved in neuroscience research? And thank you both for being here.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and start. So our report was really starting to think about what is the concept of race. And here is a quote about when people talk about the concept of race. Most people believe that they'll know it when they see it, but still are hard pressed to define it. So, a summary of the task of the committee was to document and evaluate how racial and ethnic categories are currently being used in biomedical research, review existing guidance for researchers on the use of race as a variable in biomedical research, and identify circumstances in which it is appropriate to use race and ethnicity in biomedical research, and circumstances in which race and ethnicity should not be used. The funders of the study include Doris Duke Foundation and the Burroughs Wellcome Fund. And what was interesting about the funders was that they had been funding additional work, really trying to interrogate how and whether we should use race and ethnicity, particularly in connection with trying to achieve health equity goals. This is the membership of the committee. And so I just want to highlight some of the things that we talked about in the committee, which included what are race and ethnicity. And so here you can see the definitions that we came up with as a committee, that race was conceived to describe and categorize people hierarchically, and it had been used to include or exclude individuals in groups. And ethnicity is used to describe people from a similar national or regional background who share common national, cultural, historical, and social experiences. But we did want to highlight that race and ethnicity are social and political constructs, often associated with a person's heritage, roots, or ancestry, but not necessarily fitting directly on that. It could also include aspects of personal identity, right? Regardless of your heritage, what do you personally identify with? And it's dynamically connected to social divisions that vary across historical, political, and geographic contexts. And we find that race and ethnicity are closely intertwined. And so race and ethnicity are not innate, unchanging characteristics. They are not synonymous with skin color, and they are not based in biology or explained by genetic variation. And so one of the things that we really focused on was looking at past studies, particularly the Human Genome Project, which showed that there was actually more genetic diversity between two Black individuals than between Black and white individuals. We also wanted to highlight that race and ethnicity are continuously changing over time. And so sometimes there could be overlap with the groups. So why are these issues challenging to solve in research? Well, I think we've already, Francis, you already mentioned it, that issues of race and ethnicity are complex, nuanced, and personal, particularly when you are thinking about trying to achieve health equity. Some uses in research reinforce misconceptions that have been proven difficult to root out, right? That we assume that racial and ethnic categories are somehow proxies for other variables when they do not necessarily actually serve as good proxies for those variables. And during our time as a committee, we had people come in and talk about skin color, which people believe perhaps are connected to races and ethnicities, and they're not, right? They have developed separately based on geographic, it's not the same gene. And so sometimes we can see variation is sometimes misattributed to race and ethnicity, but we definitely understand in other instances that race and ethnicity are used to track diversity of study participants, which is a separate question than how it should be used for the actual science. And so, although it is not biological, race continues to be relied upon as a blunt tool or variable. So, why do we continue to use race and ethnicity? And this is definitely one of the things that the committee wrestled with, particularly in our charge, is how do you continue to use this? Should you continue to use race and ethnicity? And how then do you achieve the goals of health equity? We found that race and ethnicity are important parts of how people identify themselves. And definitely listening to community, it was important for them to be able to share that information. Race and ethnicity data are needed to identify and monitor persistent health disparities and to hopefully get us to achieving health equity. But tracking race and ethnicity can improve also accountability for diverse enrollment. And so it's important to evaluate potentially implications of using race and ethnicity, the benefits, and the risk of not using these tools. So I just want to highlight two other points. So our approach really was to begin to say, if we're thinking about race and ethnicity, you have to think about it at each step of the research process, right? So that includes when you're thinking about what the research is going to be, your study design, recruitment, enrollment, data collection, analysis, interpretation of results, the dissemination, and then reevaluating it again in the use of race. And what often happens is that people only capture it at the beginning or one particular part. And so we think that it's important to engage in a deliberate ongoing discussion of the use of race and think about why you are using it and ensure you're clearly defining it. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but some of the things you should think about are the historical and social context, realizing that it's changed. Even the definitions of race and ethnicity have changed. Scientific rationale, is it connected to your research question? The context for partnering with specific populations and communities, and are you using it to hopefully have diverse representation and equity, and whether inferences are supported based on data and study design and the potential implications and limitations for doing that. And so this is sort of what we looked at, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Margaret.
You're muted, Margaret.
You'd think you'd learn, wouldn't you, eventually? Hang on a second. Now I messed up my screen. Okay, so when you're thinking about improving recruitment, engagement, and access for both clinical reasons, research reasons, you do need to, and we discussed, the wide range of types of research, whether it's cell or bench science, whether you're under the hood, what does race have to do with that? Or is this a clinical trial, or is it qualitative research, for example? And it all has to do with the same idea of the last circle that Ruqaiijah just put up, the concept of the research process. So when you're initially thinking, what is it I'm going to research? And then how am I going to, what's my real study question? Does race have any place in there? Why or why not? And then as you went around the circle, there is recruitment and so forth. Well, if you are doing cell biology, often you don't even know where the cells came from, or you might know a name or a number, but you may not even know what the race is. Now moving forward, you might, because people have figured out what I forgot, Henrietta Lacks, just taking people's cells willy-nilly and so forth. So even in the cell area, we had some conversations. But if you're going to be in the clinical research area with people, you will see that you need to take and have an understanding at each of those processes, analysis and dissemination, everything. You should stop and say, is race and ethnicity an important part here? And how do I need to, honor that? What am I doing here? So the only one part of that circle was the one that possibly was, basic bench science, where you may not have to worry about it, depending on, if you knew where your cells are coming from and so forth. But in neuroscience, and I don't pretend to be a neuroscientist, although my father was a neurosurgeon, I don't know if that counts. Anyway, you need to know the important thing is that circle, which represents every part of the research process, from conception to recruitment to the process of what you're going to do, all hinging on what is the question, and then analysis, how are you going to analyze the data and so forth. And then later I'm going to be talking about a specific population where even the data is an important consideration to the group itself. Normally it's important to the individual, but this is important to the group for some legal and political reasons. So go back to the circle and remember to question at each area of the research process. Why are we asking? How does it affect my strategies? What will the process be? And so forth. So researchers should focus on studying how a population has experienced and then how it manifests that experience based on, for instance, social determinants of health, structural determinants of health, actual inequities in healthcare suffered due to their assigned or perceived race and ethnicity, and how these impact brain function, rather than attributing differences solely to the fact that somebody's African American or American Indian or Hispanic and so forth. So more so than how is race a factor in neuroscience research, one should consider these characteristics and circumstances. Remember to keep ethical considerations. In other words, will your participants know your question and really why are they being included, and what do you know about them? Has there been engagement with their population, their communities, so you even know backgrounds and circumstances and so forth? So it takes a lot of work, but to really delve into populations that are not your own, you really need to have some trust and time with the population before just delving in. So those are some of the things that we thought were important.
Great, and I'll just jump in and further expand on the things that Margaret said. And so one of the things, and we've talked about this, but I really want to highlight the conclusion that's at the bottom, that race and ethnicity conflate many concepts and collapse multi-dimensional information about people's experiences and identities. There is a need for disaggregation of related concepts, and I'll talk about some of the concepts we thought were more important, and for increased granularity in the data collected to better capture the information for which race has been a proxy. And so what does that look like? We recommend that you identify applicable concepts related to race and ethnicity, that you should strive to identify concepts that are conflated with race. And that includes environmental, economic, behavioral, and social factors, including those related to racism. Based on those concepts, researchers should select applicable measures using multiple to the greatest extent possible. So what are those measures? And Margaret already began talking about some of those, but those include relational aspects of race, structural racism, the ways that our systems are set up to limit people's access to either equal health care or to environmental toxins that then could impact their bodies. But the difference that we wanted to highlight is that oftentimes when we think about perhaps structural racism, we just look at it impacting Black individuals or people of color, not understanding that it can impact people in that environment, which can include whites as well. It can include Asians and American Indians, but you would miss that because you would only focus on the race aspect and not understand that it could actually be an environment in which there are diverse groups of races and ethnicities in that environment. Ethnicity, language, and religion, immigration status, ingenuity, skin color, or pigment, which, as I mentioned before, does not track easily on races, known ancestry, genetic markers, biomarkers, and other biological identifiers. And so what we really wanted to do was to have people ask, if race and ethnicity are to be included, what's the purpose for including them? It's great to have a diverse participation of participants in your trial, but what diversity are you trying to get? Is it socioeconomic status? Is it neighborhood? Is it age? What are you trying to get? And how is that connected to overall health in your research question? Are there other concepts that could be measured to better inform or contemplate the analysis? And can multiple measures be included, analyze, and compare? And then analyze the data to tease apart underlying mechanisms. And so I'll stop there, but just highlighting again what Margaret said in terms of the will and the ways that we should think about it, which also includes community engagement and partnership to begin to ask these questions about, is race even relevant and why, right? Is race and ethnicity even relevant and why? So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it back over to Margaret.
Thank you. Okay. Am I unmuted? I can't see.
Yeah, you only Margaret, we see your presenter view, which is okay. Just it shows your notes as well if there are any.
I'll swap.
Yeah.
I don't even know if I had
Yep.
notes, but that's okay.
There we go.
All right.
Looks great. Thank you.
So I was asked to talk a little bit about American Indians. It's sort of a special case regarding race, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. And we're one of the most understudied, treated, known at all about. So there's going to be some protocols and things that if people want to include American Indians in studies or even in clinical care, things that they need to know. So this is just sort of a primer, and I do this often in my talks because I've found in 25 years of academia, very few people really know anything about American Indians. And it's by design, actually, that you don't know it K through 12, through college, unless you sought it out, or in the health professions. It's rarely discussed, which is why I did that text, which, by the way, in nursing was the first text ever on American Indians, and that was 2015, if that tells you anything. So, American Indians, did you know that they are distinguished from all other minority groups, and how they are distinguished by all other minority groups? Well, first, who are American Indians in the eyes of the US? And I often take this around when I'm talking because so many people are under the impression of my great-grandmother was a native, or so I heard, and so therefore I'm checking American Indian and I'm American Indian. But actually, legally, politically, and otherwise, American Indians are only those people who are enrolled members of a federally recognized tribe. This is legal definition that a lot of people don't realize, that they shouldn't be checking things unless they're actual tribal members. Tribal members, I don't know how many of you know, we run around actually with cards and pedigrees that say this much of me is Hidatsa and the 3 affiliated tribes in North Dakota. This much of me is Canadian Sioux and Saskatchewan, blah, blah, blah. We literally run around with these things. And that's by design from the US. How many tribes are there? I asked this question again for 25 years across the country, and I rarely get the answer. I've had anything from 3 to 1 million. And I say, well, I just introduced myself with 3 tribes, so that's it, you know, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara. Or there's roughly 3 million people who are eligible for Indian Health Services, which means they are likely federally recognized. You have to be to get Indian Health Service. So does that mean every 3rd person is a tribe? People just have no conception. But there's 574 federally recognized tribes, and that's after about 100 were cut off in the termination period in the 50s. So they were close to 700. There's about 66 state recognized tribes. Some of those were terminated or not recognized. It's a whole thing. But anyway, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and still are many hundreds in the US, but rarely does a health professional or researcher know that or understand that. And as I travel around again, I often say, how many tribes are in your state wherever I'm speaking? And I'm telling you, 90% of the time, people don't know the number. And if they do know the number, they couldn't tell me who they are. And so it's really an understudied all the way around. I mean, we can't even get to patient care or research participant. People know almost nothing about American Indians, and I'll let you know why that's important here. So American Indians are distinguished from all other groups in the following ways, which again, many people don't know. We are not other either, which is where we usually land in most studies. You know, I go to things like Gerontological Society of America and APHA, the public health one. These places have 3,000 to 5,000 papers delivered. I'd say 5 are on American Indians, and they're usually students, nothing wrong with that, but students, you know, who talk to 5 people or something. And so if we do appear on the big charts that you see from all the 5,000, we're under other. We're almost never named. And so that is a big problem. So how are we different? First of all, number one, the number one issue in Indian country is sovereignty. Do people know that Indian country is an actual legal term, meaning reservations, pueblos, trust lands, and reserved lands? The number one issue is sovereignty. Is this an issue for African American or Asian or Pacific? No, it's only because we are the original sovereigns of the land, been here for 15 to 20,000 years in this place. And so we were always sovereigns, and we were even recognized as sovereigns in the beginning, 1700s. That's how treaties came about, because they Europeans recognized us as sovereigns and made treaties with us until the late 1800s. So we are now dual citizens, also different within the boundaries of what is the US. I don't mean from France and here. I mean from within this land, these boundaries, we are dual citizens. I have my citizenship card for my tribe, and I have my passport. Either one can get me across the border. Anyway, but we were also the last people to get citizenships. African-American men in the late 1800s, women, except for American Indians, 1920, and then finally American Indians, 1924. So here we are, the very last citizens, though we've been here for tens of thousands of years. We also suffered genocide at the hands of the US. I won't go into it broadly. There's I can't remember, I didn't look for today, but there's 5 or 6 elements to the crime of genocide as laid out by the UN's Convention on Genocide in 1948. You can line up what's called the federal policy periods for American Indians, almost line by line with those elements. Every one of those elements of the crime are met, including taking away the children, the whole boarding school thing, sterilizing women, which happened in Indian Health Service through the 1970s, outright killing with the wars, pushing them into reservations. Anyway, It was literal genocide. Some people try to soft soap it and say cultural genocide. It was actually both. We're the only population listed in the US Code, Title 25, called Indians. There's no other population there. American Indians are a political body with partial sovereign status today. So what does that mean? You know, we have tribal health, tribal schools, tribal governments, tribal police. We don't have armies and money and whatever, so we are partial sovereigns. No other group, no other racial ethnic group can say that. And as such, we're the only population mentioned in the Constitution, meaning it's broadly, you know, other nations, states, and tribes. But also, with that comes that we're the only group that could have their identity legislated in or out. So that's a big difference from, my husband is Black. Tomorrow, the government can't come say, you're not Black tomorrow, but they can come to me and say, you're no longer an Indian, we're getting rid of your tribe, you don't count. Because I just told you that the definition in the US of an American Indian is a member of an enrolled, federally recognized tribe. And that has happened across the country. In the termination period, like I said, 100 tribes were wiped out, and they said, politically, and they said, we're no longer have anything to do with you. You're not an Indian. So those people are just rolling around. That's a huge, huge difference. No other ethnicity or race can have their identity wiped out by Congress. So this is just the mention. There's 3 mentions in the Constitution. It's probably the main one. Congress has the power to regulate foreign nations, several states, Indian tribes. So back to the report. Sorry, my screen is crazy. Okay, participants are sometimes left out of analysis due to, and I put this up using the American Indian exemplar that I'm giving you here. There is a lot of, although this is directly out of the report, missing data. There's small group sizes. We are 1%, 2%, or 3% of the population, depending on how you count it, whether you are a federally recognized or one of the terminated line or a state recognized tribe. We are very, very small. So if you think about it, we were 100% of the population before contact, and now we're 1% of the population. That disaggregation, I think Ruqaiijah mentioned or alluded to it. Again, there's 574 tribes. There's no real pan-American Indian. So researchers should notice that and do tribally specific or regionally specific, or say, if you're just doing some broad American Indian thing, what's the purpose? What's the question? What is it you're really trying to find out? And again, now there are, I think it's 80% of American Indians are off reservation. So now there's been a lot more intermarriage and so forth. And so although many people are 1 or 2 races or 3 races and American Indian, they are always American Indian because of the political body, but they, of course, you can check as many boxes as you want, but you will always have American Indian because that is your citizenship in a way. So there's no standard way to account for this. I just like to also mention, I think I only have one more slide, that they are the largest misidentified, I hope I didn't already say that, largest misidentified group ever. Studies show that American Indians are misidentified 40% of the time. All other groups, it's 4% of the time, because A, people are like, oh, they're still Indians. B, everybody thinks I'm Italian because they just don't think there's Indians, and so all this data is not only missing, but it's wrong. And as bad as our numbers are, and they are highest life, our lowest life expectancy, some of the highest mortality rates across the board, terrible, but those are even wrong. It's even worse than that because we're so misidentified. And then I think I alluded to this before. If you really want to work with these groups, it's time and it's trust. That's the bottom line of all of this. You can't just say, I think I'm going to go to a tribe tomorrow and study Navajo. It's never going to work. you have to invest, especially on reservation-based research, you have to invest time, figure out how you're going to enter in with personal and professional trails, spend time on site, get to know people. And then there's this whole protocol process, like their own IRBs going in front of tribal councils, tribal presidents, governors, chiefs, whatever they call their top person. And it can take months. It can take up to a year sometimes to actually get approvals. And this is the last one. So contemplate the key questions. What methods will be used to recruit and include these participants? How is multiracial ancestry? And when you do have an American Indian, that's always going to be checked. What is known about this context? And consider comparing results using alternate approaches for multiracial analysis. The final thing that I'll say is that American Indians are already a political body. So when we talk about different ways of looking at race, they already have one built in. You can say, I'm looking at this sovereign nation here and what's happening versus American Indians. If you can, I hope I'm saying that clearly. And I think, yeah, that's my last one on this. I'm not sure if you wanted me to go into the executive thing.
Well, yeah, maybe as we transition into our Q&A, reminder to everyone, you can either type your question in the Q&A function, or in a moment, just raise your Zoom hand or put your video on and I'll get you a discussion queue. But to kick that off, I'd like to ask one question, and we had sort of talked about it a little bit already, but could you talk a little bit about implications, if any, of recent executive actions and agency actions? Of course, there's been a lot and more to come around diversity, equity, inclusion. Any implications for our conversation today, for what biomedical researchers should be thinking about race and ethnicity, about our approach to the inclusion and equity recommendations you're making in front of you? Just you've both thought a lot about this, and you're in the heart of sort of navigating these new challenges, and love to hear your perspectives.
I'll go quickly just because I just happen to have a slide. So, and it's fairly easy to talk about for American Indians. For all the reasons that I just told everybody, that we're a political body, we have so far escaped any DEI ramifications. And so what do I mean by that? Is that the government, some of them are recognizing that we are partial sovereigns, and there's treaties in place and these sorts of things, a lot of legal entanglements and whatnot, and 574, chiefs and bodies and so forth, that it would get quite sticky. So Kennedy is the one who is championing actually American Indians right now. So one of my sons actually worked at Indian Health Service. He just started maybe a couple months ago. And while he was there, I don't know, it might have been Halloween, not Halloween, Valentine's, and 1,000 people were cut from Indian Health Service. And Kennedy said, absolutely not, and put them back up and said, we are going to honor the treaties and the sovereignty and so forth. So for the moment, I've heard through the grapevine that, for instance, missing and murdered women, DEI parts have been cut out that aren't American Indians, but the American Indian one is still standing. So because of all those reasons that I said that we are different, so far, it's been saved to the side. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, and I can just briefly jump in. So the work that we did around the continued use of race and ethnicity is not DEI work. And so it does not, and the executive order should not impact the work that you're doing. And furthermore, there have been lots of challenges that have basically stopped the implementation of the executive orders around DEI and DEIA, in part because legally all of those practices are still legal. And you can't change the law unless you actually have a change that is done by Congress or the courts. And so even though we see some federal websites going down, some language being removed, when you look legally at federal law and state law, there are still requirements, right, that are in place. And so what I would say to people is that this report is still noteworthy because it provides frameworks and questions for you to think about why are you actually including people in your research, and connecting that to the research question, right? More so then that supports your continued use of it, of those factors, if you find that they are really linked to the research.
Thanks you to both. I have one more question, and then I do want to, we'll just go to audience questions after that. So sort of raise your hand if you want to get in the queue, get in the Q&A, and I will get to you. But I want to go back to something, Professor Yearby, that you talked about how conflated a measure race or measures race and ethnicity are. And then, you spelled out a bunch of and the recommendation was to get more granular, a specific measure or measures for social determinants of health, a measure of racism. There's some who've argued, and I'm wondering what the committee and each of you think about this, that given how problematic that one variable is, and because it conflates so much, why not recommend to stop using it altogether and just use these others? Why keep attaching to such a problematic measure that I think, some of this argument would be that most researchers in neuroscience and elsewhere aren't going to follow the beautiful circle that you laid out. They're pretty much going to have their data and they're going to just see, hey, can we add race to the regression? Can we just, it feels like sometimes in practice, it doesn't have the sort of meaningful use that you're recommending. So I'm just wondering if the committee thought about, recommending not to use race at all and to replace it with those measures or measures of genetic ancestry and so forth.
Margaret, did you want to go first?
I'm trying to think. I know that we did have it on that one slide. It's to help with diversity, casting that net wide enough. And then understanding what your question is and how to then analyze what you found in that net. Versus if you wipe it all away, it's the circumstance, sort of the thing I talked about before, the circumstances, and as Ruqaiijah also did, and as we say with those Robert Wood Johnson, I think it was them, or was it the Kaiser family with the zip codes? Who are you capturing in that zip code? And it could be people with the same experiences, white, Black, Hispanic. However, because of traumas and historical traumas added on to that from these other populations, even though they all have the same experience within that zip code, there are some added traumas from until we can all stop. Yeah, I mean, it's a fact right now. It's a reality, I guess I should say, that people do see race and treat it various ways, until we get past that, I think we have to still figure it out.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in to build on that, is that when we talk to the community members, one of the things that they identified for us is that their race and ethnicity were important to them. And so they wanted to continue to see it, and to continue to talk about what that meant. And even Margaret's discussion of American Indians, of like knowing that history is important. And then finally, what often happens is that if we're talking about trying to eradicate health disparities, trying to achieve health equity, we'll really never know that if that's the case, if we don't take into account things that have been used to oppress and discriminate against people. Furthermore, the last thing I would say is that oftentimes we ignore the expansive impact of racism and discrimination. And so sometimes it could be a way to hide it, and not see it. And I'll just give you one example is that often in the United States, we talk about the terrible outcomes in terms of infant deaths, right? Our high rates of infant mortality and our high rates of maternal mortality. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that we always highlight how Black women have the poorest rates. Now, what we don't do though is also look at other races and ethnicities and also note that they have really poor health outcomes as well when it comes to infant and maternal mortality. So if you keep the race, that allows you to see that it is broader and makes you start to question what is the overall root cause instead of just looking at one particular group, which is what we tend to do and default to. So that's what I would.
Next question comes from Alex Ireland, and it's you just mentioned history, and it's a nice dovetail to this question. Alex asks, how do you go about using historical research and previous literature that could be potentially flawed when considering the use of race and ethnicity? Great question.
Yeah, we did discuss that. We referred to it, I think, in the report as legacy data because definitions change. I think Ruqaiijah mentioned that in her opening. And even labels have changed again for my group, Indians, Native Americans, Indigenous, American Indian and so forth, each one meaning something different and each one having a different group. And it's only recently that more than one race has been checked. So then when you compare to American Indian data that was just American Indian solely, and now you have American Indian, but they've checked two other things, how do we put that together? And that's with any group, anybody having the multi-racial issues. So we did discuss in some cases you might not use the legacy data.
Yeah, and I'm just going to share my screen really quickly to show what we talked about regarding that. So we talked about that some legacy race and ethnicity data should no longer be used since the reporting and knowledge has changed over time. And so it might be problematic. And so one of the things that we said is that that you should recognize these limitations and provide an operational definition of race and ethnicity within these products, explain the rationale and limitations of this approach, including data sets and other legacy data. And you should assess and report the performance of biomedical technology across the range of groups. And so I just wanted to show this is that, yes, we understand that. And part of our recommendation is to be able to get people to talk about the biases, the problems of trying to reconcile, and to acknowledge the limitations of the data, and begin to think about should you use the data at all. So I'll stop sharing, but I did want to show that we definitely thought about that in our report as well.
Yeah, I'll add one more note on that. It's coming up, not just, and I think the report is getting to that too, not just with historical data, but contemporary data, where one is not collecting those variables, but it's just in the data set that one's implementing or especially aggregating over many, many data sets. In the context of AI, our lab has argued that in the same way that you would talk about the quality of other data in your system, that you should talk about the quality or the unknown quality and just admit, hey, we're using these variables, but we don't know how good they are. For instance, in electronic health records, as I'm sure that you talked about in the committee, the data, even though it seems, the patient data and they've got a code for race, those codes are often inaccurate because the measure sometimes is just being taken by the hospital attendant who just looks at the person and says, oh, I guess I'm going to check this box. And I think increasingly that's a major challenge because if you're not asking the questions yourself, you're just gathering the data from somewhere else, it becomes, I think, really easy for no one to ask the question at any point along the line. And you just assume, oh, yeah, that's good data. And the focus just sort of purely on whether it's missing or not as it from a data analysis perspective, whether as to distinct question, is the data that is in there quality or not? I have a question for you, Margaret. And again, we have a little time here if there are any other questions, so I won't hog the whole story, but I have so many questions. I'll ask one more and then invite anyone else to jump in. And it's an operational kind of a concrete question. So neuroscience is certainly in those fields that you've described that have not historically been very engaged with American Indian communities. As that starts to change, and I know I have some colleagues who are starting to work on that with here at the U, what would you recommend when it gets to the point of, okay, you've built a community relationship, you've done that, but the concrete question of how am I going to make some measurement of this complicated variable so that I can report it in my study, so that I can maybe use it in my analysis, et cetera. What is the recommendation that you'd make for approaching that, to a researcher who's like, hey, help, I want to do the right thing, but I don't know what to do.
Yeah, and it differs across whether it is reservation-based or urban-based. So reservation-based is difficult, but in one way it's easier because it is one political body. So you can say people from this political, this body, this anyway, it's one partially sovereign group. And so to do that, like I said, you would have had to jump through all sorts of hoops. But each tribe, most tribes, I should say, do have education leads and health leads and so forth. So you would work closely with whichever one made more sense, as well as getting the permissions. You can't do anything without the permissions. And then you have to get the people that you're going to be trying to recruit, you have to have some sort of relationship. So it's also often visiting or having put on a lunch, or you have to really get in there into the population. You can't just go and think that they're going to work with you. So once you do that, you have to also understand that the data belongs to the tribe. And a lot of universities and NIH and others have a lot of trouble with that. But again, it's like you wouldn't go to France and say, give me all your stuff and I'm taking, it's another body. And so you have to work out with them, what can I analyze? What can I say? Can I even name you? What can I disseminate? It's you really have to work with them. It's not just go in and introduce and spend some time. You really have to work side by side. So some tribes will say you can't use our name, but you could say a tribe in the Southwest or something like that, or you can report on this but not this. It's their data, so a lot of scientists don't understand that either. Then it gets more complicated, I think. In one way, it's easier because you don't jump through all the hoops, but you should jump through some hoops in the urban area. So for instance, here in Minneapolis, there's the MUD group, it's called. It's the Indian Urban Group Directors. And you might want to bring your idea to them, even though it's not an official protocol, and say, I'm thinking of doing X, Y, and Z. And then they're not owning it, but you have to really be careful on how you report out what you have found. And you also have to make sure that who you're speaking to is actually an American Indian, because you have that problem of both ways. American Indians being misidentified as not being American Indian, and others who are saying they are American Indian, but they are not. And so this data is going to be sullied. So it really takes a lot of thinking, is all I can say.
If I could follow up on that as well, one of the other, I think probably the most common way that race and ethnicity is measured in neuroscience research and just in social and behavioral research, biomedical research, is through, self-report on a either pen and paper or, computerized tablet. And the Office of Management and Budget is, again, you both know it, for our audience may not know, has just early this, well, I guess now 2024, so last year, for the first time in over a decade, updated the baseline or minimum categories So I think most on this call will remember at some point filling out a form where there was first Hispanic or non-Hispanic, and then there were some options. The new version, I want to read it out and see if, given how much you've both thought about this, if this strikes you as on the right track, not enough. These are the minimum categories: American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, Middle Eastern or North African, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and white. And then individuals could choose, multiple of those. Um, would that be an appropriate way, do you think, to measure this complicated variable, or is there something missing? I mean, I think it received over 20,000 comments, this thing, so it's just difficult.
Yeah, and we talked about it in our report and said that yes, it could be used to report study enrollment, but the problem along with those things is that they don't translate to science, right? In the sense of what factors are you looking at? And as Margaret has noted several times, what happens if people are from multiple groups? Right. We in the US used to go by the one drop rule. So as long as you were one drop black, you were just black. But that doesn't go to the scientific questions that you are trying to answer. And so, yeah, it could be great for study enrollment to ensure that you have some diversity in the study enrollment. But then when you get to the research questions, what we're asking you to do is to use things that are more connected to science and things that you can say, okay, we're looking at the environment. Here is the environmental exposure, and we can connect that to the neuroscience or our research question.
Yeah, and the other problem is that whole aggregation thing. So Hispanic, are you from Cuba, Mexico, Colombia? So I guess in casting the net, yes, I got Hispanic people. But then when you come to analysis, what are you going to do with that? Same with natives. Alaska Native is much different than Seminole in Florida or from the plains and so forth. So you might get some people, but then when you come to analysis, what are you going to do? What's your plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's a theme emerging here, and it was, of course, in the report as well, is that being precise both in the data you're collecting, but then how you use it and why you're using it is really central. We're just about out of time, but I wanted to give you both just a minute here at the end to offer any kind of final thoughts and recommendations. I think for an audience where, again, I think we have a lot of trainees in the audience. If people see this, we'll share it with them. Um, and there's not a lot of training in neuroscience and in other biomedical sciences for how to work effectively and ethically with race and ethnic categories and analysis. What would you recommend as the next step? Of course, read the report front to back, but any practical piece of advice you would give?
Yeah, I think just starting to even think about race and all the nuances. We never really thought about it before. For a long time, NIH has said, you must think about these categories. Are you, including these people? And all we would do is go, okay, yes, 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 without too much thought. So this is sort of a long step down the road where, does it make sense? Even if you do from your very first, what is my question? What is my aim? What are my specific aim? What am I doing? Start thinking about race there, and does this make sense? How am I going to incorporate it? If you even get that far, you're way down the road from how it has been.
Yeah, and just to build on that, don't just rely on historical uses of race and ethnicity, believing that will support the science and support your work, right? That there are lots of questions about how we have used it in the past, defined it in the past, and will continue to change the definition. So, really, as Margaret said, begin to think about why you're using it. Is it connected to the research question? Don't just do the default. And then if it is not connected to the research question, be honest about that.
That's a really nice way to end. Thank you, Professor Yearby. Thank you, Dr. Moss, and thanks to everyone for being here on an evening to talk about this important topic. And thanks to all those who may be watching later. And finally, thanks, of course, to the NIH Neuroethics program for supporting this work. And want to learn more about Reach for Brain, reachforbrain.org, and we'll have our next program later this spring around community engagement and neuroscience research. Thanks for everyone. I'm going to end the meeting, and we'll see you down the line. Take care. Bye-bye.